Stories from ABC News. Protesters in Hong Kong have been given a deadline to end their demonstrations in the city by tomorrow. Hong Kong's leader has warned that police will take all necessary actions to ensure government offices and schools reopen on Monday. Thousands of people have taken part in the pro-democracy rally, which has blocked main streets for more than a week. The Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, has reiterated the case for military action in Iraq, saying it's in the national interest. His comments came as the US military released new video of aircraft taking off in the Arabian Gulf to conduct strikes against Islamic State militants. Their goal is to halt the insurgents' advance towards the Syrian border of Kobani. Police are investigating a gruesome discovery in Brisbane. They found human remains in a unit at Tenerife and the body of a man in a nearby street. Roads in the area have been closed as they look for clues. And excitement is building in Sydney as the Rabbitohs prepare to take on Canterbury in tonight's grand final in Sydney. More than 80,000 people are expected to watch the match. Police say they'll be out in force and will take a zero-tolerance approach to antisocial behaviour at the ground. Stay tuned now for Insiders with Barry Cassidy.
Looking at Europe.
Hello and welcome to The World This Week. I'm Oscar Sabakti. Coming up, the streets of Hong Kong fill with thousands of protesters, America's first case of Ebola, and a resignation after the US Secret Service is accused of failing to protect the White House.
Don't let somebody get close to the president. Don't let somebody get close to his family. Don't let them get in the White House, ever.
The size and scale of the pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong took the world by surprise. On a holiday meant to celebrate the birth of China's Communist Republic, thousands of Hong Kong's residents took to the streets to protest against Beijing's control over their government and demanding democratic reforms. What started out as a student-led movement came to include families, business people and the elderly. China correspondent Stephen McDonnell reports from Hong Kong.
Heart of a gleaming financial metropolis, there are no cars on normally jammed streets. The centre of Hong Kong has been fenced off and is not in the hands of those who normally run the city. Instead, it's being occupied by many thousands of protesters. They're calling for the Chinese government to change its mind and allow the people, rather than a committee controlled by Beijing, to select candidates for elections in 2017.
I think the Chinese authorities have been shocked by the large turnout, but nonetheless, the chance of the Chinese authorities making concessions remain far from optimistic.
Politics professor Joseph Cheng from Hong Kong's City University is involved in this movement as a campaigner.
People feel that if I don't come out and speak up, I may not even have a chance to do so in a few years' time. If we speak out, at least we have not failed. At least we can maintain our principles and our dignity.
This huge and swelling movement has until now been dominated by students, but others are joining in. This boy's grandfather accompanied him. The man speaks to us in Cantonese and his grandson translates.
We'll continue
every day. If the China say, I give you the call soon, we will stop to do this.
So Hong Kong people will keep protesting?
Yes.
After several days of protest, the Hong Kong government tried a heavy-handed approach to clear the streets, hoping that a major display of force would break the will of the students. They went in hard. But it seems they underestimated the demonstrators who've been preparing for this moment for many months.
In terms of the tactical use of riot police, this would have to go down as one of the more spectacular failures we've seen in recent times. The Hong Kong government wanted to clear a smaller, much smaller group of students from the streets, and instead what they've ended up with is this: thousands upon thousands of students now committed and not prepared to stand down until their demands are met.
There's certainly optimism here amongst some that the students can win, but they're definitely preparing themselves for the worst.
The protesters think that riot police could come down this road, and so here's their answer. They've built this sort of protective barricade along here. You'll notice these umbrellas are being turned up in that sort of shape to try and catch tear gas or pepper spray. And there's bits of concrete in here, and even the police's own equipment all being cobbled together to build a sort of makeshift wall. Now, what this is designed to do is not to keep the riot police out altogether, but just to slow them down enough to allow people to get out of here if there was a full-on assault on the main protest area.
In Beijing, the Chinese government is watching to see how Hong Kong handles this.
The central government will unswervingly implement the guidelines of one country, two systems and the basic law, and steadfastly safeguard the long-term prosperity and stability of Hong Kong and Macau. We firmly believe that compatriots in Hong Kong and Macau will create an even better future in the big family of the motherland.
Even thunderstorms have not been able to force these agitators home. Instead, they seem to be digging in ever more. And their ranks are being filled with those who say they'd normally never join a demonstration.
Do you think that in the long run the protesters will win?
I'd like to be optimistic, but I don't think so. But we're doing what we can. At least we have to make it known and show the government that there are plenty of people that who are unhappy about this.
When things become violent, we shall retreat. We don't want to have a Tiananmen Square kind of scenario. We are prepared to retreat, to go home, recuperate, then launch another campaign some other time. We realize we cannot achieve everything with one campaign. It's going to be a very long-term struggle.
As the Ebola virus continues to sweep across West Africa, US medical authorities have confirmed the country's first case. A man who travelled from Liberia to visit relatives in Texas fell ill after he arrived, and now questions have been raised about why he wasn't immediately isolated. From Washington, Jane Cowan reports.
It's a troubling milestone in the spread of the deadliest ever Ebola outbreak. Inside this Dallas hospital lies the first Ebola patient diagnosed inside the United States.
This individual had no symptoms when departing Liberia or entering this country.
Unlike previous American cases involving doctors and aid workers, this patient isn't thought to have been involved in the response to the epidemic in West Africa. The CDC director is at pains to point out the patient didn't get sick until about 4 days after he arrived in the US, which means he wouldn't have been infectious while he was on the plane. But there was a period of several days between the person developing symptoms and when he was put into isolation. Authorities are tracing those he came in contact with during that time.
If he was staying in the household during the time that he was potentially contagious, that is with fever and other symptoms, yes, they could have been exposed.
Hospitals here in the US have already treated several patients with Ebola, but until now, all of them have been diagnosed in West Africa. Authorities emphasise the health system here is much better equipped to contain the threat, but not everyone is convinced.
Staff is right at the critical number to make that hospital work on a normal day. Do they have the surge capacity to take staff out of the hospital to look after an Ebola patient? No, they don't.
The reality is, as long as the outbreak continues in Africa, the United States and the world has to remain on guard.
To Iraq now, where Islamic State extremists have been halted after advancing to within 10 kilometres of Baghdad. But in Syria, American airstrikes failed to stop the assault on the town of Kobani near the Turkish border. ABC correspondent Matthew Carney reports from the United Arab Emirates.
Turkish tanks and armoured vehicles have taken up positions on a hill overlooking the besieged Syrian border town of Kobani. Shelling by Islamic State insurgents in Syria has intensified and stray fire hit Turkish soil. The military detonated the unexploded mortars.
Their mortars are falling here every day. Our lives are at risk. If the Turkish soldiers are to protect us, they have to target the Islamic State militants.
Now, Turkey's leaders say they can no longer stay out of the fight.
We have to wage a common fight against terrorism, and this can't be done by airstrikes only. There should be ground operations as well.
On the Syrian front, the Kurdish fighters backed by American airstrikes have been battling to keep IS militants at bay. The extremists are now within 5 kilometres of Kobani, the closest they've been in their 2-week assault on the border town. And in Iraq, government forces move on Islamic State fighters who are perilously close to Baghdad. Some reports suggest they are just 10 kilometres from the capital's outer fringe.
The Iraqi state is facing for the first time an existential threat. This existential threat is that there's somebody else claiming sovereignty over Iraqi territory. Nobody else did it. That never happened before.
Here, the US-led airstrikes have helped Iraqi troops to halt Islamic State's advance, for the moment at least.